Welcome, champions, to the next overview and tier list ranking, featuring the newest and/or reworked champion for the current event in Idle Champions. This is where we'll break down their mechanics and place them in my overall tier list for every champion in the game. And of course, before we dive in, I'm gonna have you take a look at my cat while I shout out my Twitch channel, where we play all kinds of games and keep active with chat, and of course go over the champions we cover in our YouTube videos the same day we release them. Hop on over and say hi. This time around, everything's kinda flip-floppity. We're getting both characters on the first day of the event, and they kind of already existed, so they're both kind of reworks, but at the same time, one of them is a rework and the other is a new champion. It'll make sense, trust me. We're talking about, of course, Beadle and Grimm. Previously, they both shared the same seat as technically the same character, and swapped between the two of them with their ultimate. So now they've been separated, and Grimm has walked over to seat 2, while Beadle stayed in seat 8. So first let's take a look at the technically new champion, Grimm. The chaotic good human barbarian now in seat 2. He now serves the group as a DPS, tanking, and breaking champion. Right out of the gate, it's important to note, inseparable. While Grimm has moved to a different seat from Beadle, they will always be available together like Kent and Virgil. Every time Grimm can be used in an adventure, so can Beadle, even if the restrictions are against tags, ages, ability scores, etc., and vice versa. Now let's break down the rest of Grimm's formation abilities, now that he counts as a tank and a breaker. First off, for his DPS, he has Get Buff, which of course has changed. Each time Grimm attacks an enemy, his base attack cooldown is reduced by 0.2 seconds. And he deals more damage, stacking up to 25 times. The equipment for this ability does scale the pre-stack, so you're going to be able to buff this up pretty good. However, there's nothing else that interacts with this ability. So that base pre-stack is what you're going to get out of it. And of course it scales multiplicatively, but the base attack cooldown will stack additively. Stacks are reset when you change areas, unless moving right along is triggered, so let's move on to that. If the party completes a new area within 15 seconds, Grimm's Get Buff and Break Their Will stacks will not reset upon entering a new area. But now, what's Break Their Will? Each time Grimm attacks an enemy and breaks at least one armor or segmented health, he breaks one more on all subsequent attacks, stacking additively up to 5 times. Stacks reset upon changing areas, unless moving right along is triggered, of course. So this is where his breaking comes from, pretty good at armor shredding. Now with his tank role, he does get a health equipment slot to make him viable for scaling his health. But he also has Barbarian's Protection, where he increases the health of all other champions by 25% of his max health, and any healing on those champions is increased by 25%. Now the last two things we have to talk about with Grimm, besides his specializations, is something that both him and Beadle share. First, let's talk about brothers in armors. If Beadle is in the formation, all of Grimm's equipment item levels are increased by Beadle's base average item level. And this also works in that Beadle's item levels will be shared with Grimm. Now, since the sharing is based on their base item level, you're still going to want to give a larger amount of item level to Grimm since he has a pre-stack. And while we haven't talked about Beadle yet, I can tell you he does not. But if you do focus Grimm, at least his average item level will be bled down to Beadle. It's an interesting way to give them both item levels through each other. Now the other thing they share is Ultimate Tag Team. When Beadle uses his ultimate ability in the same party as Grimm, Grimm's ultimate ability goes on cooldown and he gains 1 tag team stack. For each tag team stack Grimm has, his ultimate cooldown is reduced by 5 seconds, and his next ultimate attack deals more damage, stacking multiplicatively. Tag team stacks cap at 10 and reset when Grimm uses his ultimate ability, and vice versa, where when Grimm does an ultimate attack, it will do the same thing for Beadle, and we'll talk about that when we get to Beadle. Now, what about his specializations? First of all, he has Giant Hunter, where Grimm gains the Hunter role as well, and giants become his favored foe. Grimm deals more damage against his favored foe, and all boss enemies will count as giants for the purpose of this ability. What's also important to note here is that Grimm's ultimate, one-on-one, has him attack the enemy with the most health and knocks back all other enemies in a small area. But in non-boss areas, a frost giant spawns in revenge. Now, this is more important beyond just him spawning his favored foe. This is our first instance of being able to force spawn giants, which of course is important for Vin Ursa and Volo, with Vin needing to critically hit with her ultimate on unique enemy types, and Volo just needing to encounter them. So we now have 13 guaranteed enemies we can force spawn. His next option is Giant Taunter, where Grimm taunts all enemies he attacks, causing them to switch targets and attack him. For each enemy that has attacked him in the current area, his damage is increased by 20%, stacking multiplicatively up to 100 times. This is just a flat damage buff, much in the way Karlach's Rage is when you take her specialization for self-DPS. And if you do fully stack it up, it's gonna be around an E11. Then he also has Giant Profits, where Grimm gains the Gold Find role, and enemies that he defeats drop 50% additional gold for each enemy he has defeated in the current area, stacking multiplicatively and capping at 20. Ultimately, this will lead you to about an E7 gold find, so nothing groundbreaking here. Especially since this is an on-kill mechanic, as that means he will not be able to be stacked with Makos bombing or anything like that. And if you're just looking to stack up his DPS, take Giant Taunter and stack it up. But there's also something to be said about his first pick. It will be nowhere near the damage buff. But sometimes you're deep enough in a push where he's not even going to be able to take a hit. But of course you could go back to an area he can, stack it up, use your bud, as always. Now we're going to talk about their availability and their tier ranks at the end, since their availability is tied together. So now let's talk about Beadle, the technically reworked champion in Seat 8. The true neutral, rogue wizard dwarf, serving your group as a support, golden control. Just like Grimm, he also has inseparable, meaning Beadle and Grimm are so inseparable that either one qualifies for an adventure restriction based on their tags, ages, ability scores, etc., then both can be used. His support comes from In the Shadows, where Beadle increases the damage of champions within 2 slots of himself, and enemies that hit targets affected by this move have a 20% chance to miss. His gold comes from Sticky Fingers, where whenever Beadle attacks an enemy, he causes it to immediately drop an amount of the gold it would award on death. As this does have equipment tied to it, you can make it push beyond 100%. The enemy will then stop and check its pockets, stunning them for 2 seconds. That can only occur to each enemy 5 times. So this is also where the control tag comes from. Now with all this in mind, you could replace him in Azaka's spot for a quote Azaka farm to free up Seat 12 for a better gold find option like Penelope or a leveled Daub, and utilize his auto attack instead of Azaka's ultimate. Though it's hard not to just recommend a dirty farm with Makos bombing. Next he has Share the Glory, where most positional formation abilities that affect Beadle also affect Grimm if he is in the formation. If Grimm is already affected by the same ability, Beadle instead increases the effect of In the Shadows by 800%. And then like I said with Grimm earlier, Beadle also has Ultimate Tag Team, where when Grimm uses his own ultimate ability in the same party as Beadle, Beadle's ultimate ability goes on cooldown as well, and he gains 1 tag team stack. For each tag team stack Beadle has, his ultimate cooldown is reduced by 5 seconds, and his next ultimate attack deals 200% more damage, stacking multiplicatively. Tag team stacks cap at 10 and reset when Beadle uses his ultimate. All of his specialization options will increase the effect of In the Shadows, and the effectiveness of all of them will scale from left to right, being better the further you go right. But they are unique restrictions, so it depends on if you can actually fit those requirements or not. First up is Epic Equipment, where the effect of In the Shadows is increased by 20% for each piece of epic or better equipment on champions in the formation, stacking multiplicatively. Premium gear will increase the effect of In the Shadows by 0.075% for every item level on your formation's champions, stacking multiplicatively, but capping at 1,800 stacks per each champion. So, 18,000 for the formation. Then there is Shiniest Loot, which increases the effect of In the Shadows by 30% for each piece of shiny or golden equipment on champions in the formation, stacking multiplicatively. Now, at maximum absolute output of each of these, epic equipment is in the E6 range, premium gear is in the E7 range, and shiniest loot is in the E8 range. So it all depends on what you can fill out in your formation. Now, what about both of their equipment, feats, and availability? Let's go ahead and rapid fire right through them. To start with Grimm, he has one for his own damage, one for get buff, and this is his pre-stack, one for his specializations, one for his health, and one for ultimate attack damage and ultimate cooldown. As it is normally with feats for someone with a pre-stack, you're gonna want to grab the pre-stack buffs from the feats, and the rest of his feats are honestly quite average. Once Gloves Off is available for gems in 90 days, or if you just pay the shop price, you can prevent roaming familiars from activating his ultimate, considering the way Tag Team works. With Beadle, through his equipment, we have Damage of All Champions, In the Shadows, Sticky Fingers, his specialization, ultimate attack damage, and ultimate cooldown. And his feats are again quite average, and he has no pre-stack, so there's nothing to look for there. But similarly to Grimm, he has the shop/gem in 90 days feat to stop roaming familiars from activating his ultimate. Now we're gonna go into their availability, and then I'm going to go into, let's call it complain mode, I guess, but we'll get to that in a second. Their availability is actually pretty simple to answer, as together, they've got the perfect availability. They have every patron covered, through Grimm being good, Grimm having enough con for Vajra, Beadle having enough int for Strahd, Grimm having enough strength and charisma for Zariel, and since they are both new and reworked, they will both be available for Elminster for 3 years. And as far as day ones go, through both of their ability scores, they are available for every day 1 trials restriction. So, let's go into Complaino mode. First of all, I'm actually going to rank them and then I'll rant. They're both landing in the B tier. You might ask why. Let me explain. They're designed to go together, Grimm and Beadle. And their kit kind of supports that, right? With their item levels being shared, with some mechanics that intertwine. However, those mechanics intertwining are too important for them, but also don't offer enough to justify it. For example, with Beadle's In the Shadows. If I happen to not be using Grimm with Beadle, In the Shadows would be literally terrible. For me at item level 1500, I'd be getting a whopping 1.18 E12. We're talking in the core champion range to even under some of the core champions. So then it's like, okay, well they have to be put together. Then we put Grimm in, and it gets up to an E14. So then we have to work around positionals affecting Grimm to further boost Beadle's In the Shadow. If we do that with a mild amount of stacks, let's say 7, then we're looking at an E22. All of that to boost Beadle's In the Shadows only to an E22. By today's standards, that's actually not that great. Now, again, it's enough to put them in the B tier because it's better than a lot of those underneath them. But to have this requirement and this is their synergy feels kind of off. Now you might be thinking, well, you need more positionals. Well, here we are with 13 positional abilities via people who offer 2 positionals, and we're looking at an E30. But then we're forced to use people like Brother Uriah, who is quite literally one of the worst buffers in the game, and getting multiple stacks from him doesn't make up the fact of a higher buff we'd bring in with someone else. So then you think, okay, but what about Grimm's numbers? He has a pre-stack. Yes, he does, and that's better than not having one, don't get me wrong, but there's nothing else that buffs that up. It is its own thing. It is its pre-stack, the end. And it stacks up to 25, and it's not too hard to get stacks. So that's not a bad thing, again. But we're talking about other DPS to contend with, like Artemis, like Cass, the Dark Urge, Birdsong Jim, even Karlach and Crux. Even though they don't have pre-stacks, their numbers get better than his. Now, again, Grimm does also have his Specialization, which offers him, in my scenario, about an E11. So overall, he's getting a self-buff of around an E35, and of course that's going to go up with item level, but again, we're talking about Cass, we're talking about Artemis, we're talking about Dirge, we're talking about Rosie. All these other DPS have pre-stacks as well that scale better. And then of course you might think, well, let's use Grimm instead of Beadle, or Beadle instead of Grimm, but they're really just tied together. And again, they're good, they're just not great. So that's why they're getting thrown in the B tier. I find them fun and kinda wanted to maybe be able to use more of Grimm plus Beadle, but I don't know, it's just kinda weird. It's like they should have just stayed in 8 and both been brought out and counted for everything in that way, and they just both had their kits all together in seat 8. That would make more sense to me. But since they've split them up, they take 2 slots in the formation, and they're not putting up top numbers, it's kind of hard to recommend them. But don't get me wrong, I'm an availability slut, and I was really hoping for them to swing a little harder, because their availability's good. Anyway, enough about those two, let's talk about the flex slot champions of this event. Because this time around, we have a lot better options than the last few. First of all, most people are going to be slotting Briv right away. If your Briv isn't to the jump you want him to be, this is the time to get working on Briv if you're looking for more jumps. Then we have the Dark Urge. A lot of people main Dirge, and the AA is very popular, so he's a great option if you plan to use the absolute adversaries or are maining the Dark Urge. Then we have Miria, an excellent tank who might struggle to find some formations, but her clone mechanic allowing her to take hits in higher areas, mixed with the fact she does indeed have a pre-stack as well, makes her a very good option. Spurt, of course, has seen less use because of his bad availability and he was nerfed recently, but still, you can reach very high numbers with him. And I've talked about Rosie already. Rosie's also here. She's a great damage dealer with good availability, and I would recommend her over Grimm, sadly speaking. Then Catti-Brie, who is an ever useful champion, doesn't scale the best with item level, but it's an option. Strix, again, sees a lot of use, can be good with Artemis, is good with her affiliation, but it is another one that doesn't quite scale well with item level, so just keep that in mind. We have Tatiana, who scales incredibly well with her item level up to a certain point for her speed mechanic. If you haven't worked on Melf yet and aren't running a super high level speed team, it can be good to focus her first so you can pull in a lot more enemies. Then on the lower end we have Alindra and Ayla. Both of them don't scale that well with item level, and while Ayla has more use than Alindra these days, they both aren't great picks for an event flex slot to gain item levels from. Well, thanks for dropping in and checking out the video. Hit that like, sub, and bell for me. Let me know what you think about Beadle and Grimm. Follow me on Twitter, Twitch, all that jazz. Probably live right now if you're watching this right when I released it. And you should know it by now, unless you're new, but if you're new, take note. Have a hell of a time out there, champion.